The mushroom picker was surrounded by bandits. But the forest did its job. No one expected that. What makes a 68-year-old man go back to the forest again and again, where, according to rumors, people have started to disappear? For Ivan Petrovich, whom everyone in the village of Kliuchi simply called Petrovich, it was not a matter of choice. The forest was his life, his breath, his freedom. He stepped onto the path damp with morning dew, and his old, worn-out boots made no sound. His gaunt, sinewy figure in faded camouflage blended with the patterns of light and shadow under the crowns of centuries-old pine trees. Every crack of a branch, every cry of a bird was an open book to him. And today, that book spoke of alarm. The air, thick and still in the anticipation of the midday heat, seemed electrified. The birds fell silent all at once, and the sudden silence was louder than any noise. Petrovich stopped, his piercing blue eyes scanning the ground intently. There it was, a broken hazel branch, broken carelessly, not by an animal, but by a person rushing headlong. He crouched down and touched the break with his fingers. Fresh. No more than an hour ago. A former gamekeeper, he could sense the false note in the forest symphony. And this note was foreign and dangerous. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. He straightened up and grabbed the woven basket more comfortably. His thoughts flowed slowly, like a forest stream. His neighbor, Baba Nyura, was wailing at the well again yesterday. The city dwellers from the new plot hadn't been seen for a week. At first, they thought they had left, but then someone saw their car abandoned by the forest road. The police came, looked around, and left. The forest is big. The local police officer sighed, but for Petrovich, the forest was not big. He knew it well, and he remembered everything. He remembered how 3 years ago, almost in this very spot, he had found a young wolf. Its gray side heaved in time with its hoarse breathing, and its front paw was stuck fast in the rusty teeth of a poacher's trap. There was no fear in the animal's eyes, only fierce, powerless hatred. Petrovich did not call for help. He slowly approached, talking to the wolf in a quiet, calm voice. He told him about the weather, about mushrooms, about his late wife. The wolf growled, but did not lunge. The old man unclipped the trap and pulled out the mangled paw. He took a flask of moonshine from his ever-present bag and washed the wound. The beast jerked, but endured. Then Petrovich bandaged the paw with a clean rag. "Go, Gray," he said. "The forest will heal you." The wolf limped away into the thicket without looking back. Petrovich didn't expect any thanks. The forest has its own laws. Today's alarm was different. It didn't smell like an animal, but like cheap tobacco and spilled gasoline. He didn't go to the mushroom spots, but where his instincts led him, toward an old abandoned sawmill. The trail became less and less visible. And then he saw a second mark, a crushed pack of cigarettes. Not ours, not from the village. Bright, imported. Next to it was a fresh footprint from a heavy boot with a tread that no one in their village had. His heart skipped a beat, but not from fear, from the thrill of the hunt. Someone was trespassing in his forest, and he didn't like it one bit. He left the basket under a fern bush and took his knife in his hand. Not just a simple mushroom knife, but an old trusty one with a wide blade that had saved him more times than he could count in the taiga. Moving now as silently as a shadow, he followed the trail. He did not yet know that he was walking toward 3 people for whom human life was worth less than the contents of his old backpack. He did not know that this day would test all his skills. And he could not have imagined that the forest had already prepared its response to the uninvited guests. A response that would come in the form of a large gray wolf with a scar on its left paw. The smell of smoke hit his nose unexpectedly. It wasn't the clean smoke from a bonfire, but a pungent smell mixed with burnt plastic. Petrovich froze behind the trunk of a thick pine tree, becoming part of the landscape. Ahead, about 50 meters away, he could see a clearing near an abandoned hut. There stood an old, battered SUV, painted in a dirty protective color. 3 men were sitting by the fire. Petrovich immediately identified the first one as the leader. He was stocky, about 40 years old, with cold, appraising eyes. When he stood up to throw some wood on the fire, his characteristic limp became noticeable. The lame one, Petrovich mentally christened him. The second was young, about 25, with a shock of red hair. He was nervously fiddling with an expensive smartphone, clearly taken from someone. Redhead. His movements were jerky, and his laugh was unpleasant and loud. The third was the most frightening. A huge, silent brute with a bull's neck and an empty stare. He just sat there, staring into the fire, and his immobility was more frightening than any threat. Silent. They talked lazily, and fragments of their conversation reached Petrovich's ears. Screamed like crazy. Not much junk, but we'll take the laptop and cell phones. Good thing they shut up quickly. The old man felt a chill inside. Summer residents. They were talking about those very summer residents. Petrovich realized that he had stumbled upon more than just poachers or illegal loggers. These were predators, far more dangerous than any bear. He had to leave. Quietly, unnoticed, and straight to the police station. He began to slowly back away, placing his feet with the caution of a wild animal. One step, another step. He had almost disappeared behind a thick spruce tree when a dry branch cracked treacherously under his boot. The sound seemed deafening in the tense silence. The conversations around the campfire fell silent instantly. "Who's there?" Rizzi shouted sharply, jumping to his feet. Petrovich froze, his heart sinking. He understood that running now would mean giving himself away. But he couldn't stay where he was either. The lame man slowly turned his head in his direction. His gray eyes seemed to see right through the trees. He didn't shout. He simply said 2 words that sent a cold shiver down Petrovich's spine. "Take him." The silent man in red, like 2 dogs let off the leash, rushed toward him. There was no choice. Petrovich turned and ran. He didn't run like a frightened victim. He ran like a hunter on his own territory, and a route was already forming in his head through the marshy lowlands to Chertov Ravine. There where the stranger would surely break his neck. The chase turned into a deadly game. The forest, which was just a jumble of trees to the bandits, was a map full of hiding places and traps for Petrovich. He didn't run in a straight line. He zigzagged like a hare, using every dip in the terrain, every fallen tree trunk. Behind him, he could hear Red's curses and Molchun's heavy breathing. They were younger and stronger, but the forest was on the old man's side. Petrovich deliberately led them toward the swamp. He knew the paths where the solid ground was hidden under a thin layer of moss. His pursuers, however, charged ahead. Suddenly, Redhead cursed and sank knee-deep into the rusty, stinking sludge. This gave Petrovich a few precious seconds. He didn't look back, but he could feel their presence, their angry, hot breath on his back. The lame man did not take part in the direct pursuit. He walked more slowly, but his calculating mind worked flawlessly. He did not follow the old man's footsteps, but tried to cut across his path to anticipate his maneuvers. And it was he who turned out to be the greatest threat. Petrovich had almost broken away from his two pursuers when, jumping out into a small clearing, he saw a limping figure right in front of him. The lame man stood leaning against a tree trunk, grinning crookedly. He had a knife in his hand. "Where are you rushing off to, old man?" he croaked. "Scared of the mushrooms." At that moment, Redhead and Silent Man stumbled out of the woods. They were dirty, angry, and out of breath. Petrovich was surrounded. There was no way back. To his left was a thick, impenetrable thicket. To his right was a steep slope leading to Devil's Ravine. The lame took a step forward, playing with his knife. "You saw our faces, old man, and that's not good. Not good at all. So let's do this quietly. No noise." Red-haired bared his teeth, his eyes burning with an unhealthy excitement. "Let me, huh, lame? I'll be quick." He took a step toward Petrovich, but the leader stopped him with a gesture. "Don't rush. Let's talk first. Maybe the old man has a stash somewhere. He probably gets a good pension, right?" Petrovich was silent. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking through them, into the depths of the forest. His breathing evened out. A strange calm descended upon him. He had lived a long life. He had seen birth and death in this forest. If he was destined to end his journey here, then so be it. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. His hand tightened around the handle of his old hunting knife. He wasn't a fighter, but he was part of this forest, and the forest did not like strangers. He slowly backed toward the edge of the ravine. Better to jump down than let these bastards finish him off. The bandit slowly closed in. Each step echoed with the hollow beat of his heart. There it was, the edge. Beyond it lay only emptiness and the sheer cliffs of Devil's Ravine. Petrovich felt a chill running down his spine. "Well, old man, you've run far enough," said the lame one, taking his last step. The redhead was already raising his fist to strike. And at that very moment, when time seemed to stand still, a low, guttural growl came from the depths of the forest. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make all three of them flinch and turn around. At the edge of the clearing, out of the thicket of juniper bushes, they emerged silently. Wolves? Not one, not two, a whole pack. 5 gray shadows moving with hypnotic grace. And in front, slightly larger than the others, stood the leader. He wasn't looking at Petrovich. His yellow, intelligent eyes were fixed on the 3 armed men. On his left front paw, just above the pads, there was an old, long-healed scar. Petrovich froze. His heart, which had just been ready to burst out of his chest, suddenly began to beat evenly and calmly. He recognized him. Gray. The silence that rang out in the clearing became thick and palpable. The bandits froze, turning into statues of flesh and fear. Their feigned cruelty, which had worked so well against the unarmed summer residents and the lonely old man, crumbled to dust in the face of a primitive, silent threat. The redhead, whose face had turned white as chalk, swallowed. The sound was loud and pitiful. He took a tiny step back, and immediately the leader of the pack slightly raised his upper lip, exposing yellowish fangs. The movement was barely noticeable, but the redhead froze as if his feet were rooted to the ground. Unlike his accomplice, the lame man did not lose his composure completely. His prison experience told him that any predator, whether human or animal, respects strength but senses panic a mile away. "Stand still. Don't move," he hissed, keeping his eyes fixed on the leader. His hand slowly, millimeter by millimeter, reached for the knife in his belt. The silent one reacted too. He didn't move, but his huge body tensed like a coiled spring. He slowly lowered his gaze, assessing the distance to the nearest wolf. For the first time that day, something resembling a thought appeared in his empty eyes, the cold calculation of a fighter. And the wolves did not stand still. They began to move, not running, but with slow, springy steps, spreading out in a semicircle. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, as if they were obeying a single will. 2 wolves circled the clearing on the left, cutting off the path to the windbreak. 2 more on the right blocked the trail the bandits had come from. The leader remained in the center, hypnotizing the trio with his unblinking gaze. They did not howl or bark. They simply did their job, encircling the enemy. The forest, which a minute ago had been a refuge for the bandits, was turning into a trap, and the gray predators were its guardians. Petrovich, taking advantage of the fact that everyone's attention was focused on the wolves, took a few slow steps to the side, toward the trunk of an old pine tree. He moved away from the edge of the ravine, leaving the line of potential attack. He wasn't afraid. He watched the unfolding drama with a kind of detached curiosity. He saw the leader twitch his ear, sensing his movement, but he didn't even turn his head. The man was out of the equation. The showdown was between the forest and those who had come here with filth and violence. "Lame, what are we going to do?" whined Red, his voice trembling. "Shut up," barked the leader. He understood that the situation was hopeless. To attack first would be suicide. 5 seasoned wolves would tear them to pieces in a minute. Trying to run was even worse. A beast always catches up with its prey. All they could do was stand and hope that the wolves would leave. But they didn't leave. The circle was closing in. The distance was reduced to 10 meters. You could already see every muscle rolling under the gray fur and smell the heavy animal scent. And at that moment, nature decided to add its own act to the play. Far on the horizon, thunder rumbled hollowly. The sky, which had been clear until then, began to darken in the west, filling with a leaden heaviness. The first gust of wind swept through the treetops, bringing with it the smell of ozone and damp earth. A storm was approaching. This change in the weather finally broke Red. His nerves couldn't take it anymore. "Damn it!" he screamed. With a convulsive movement, he pulled a small pistol from his belt, a trophy from one of his previous robberies. His hands were shaking so much that he could barely hold the gun. "Get out of here, you bastards!" he yelled, pointing the barrel at the leader. "Don't you dare, you idiot!" cried Lame, but it was too late. A shot rang out. The sound, sharp and alien, shattered the silence of the forest. The bullet whistled into the sky, harming no one. But the sound was a signal. The leader didn't jump back. He just pressed his ears back and let out a short, sharp growl, and the pack exploded into motion. But it wasn't a chaotic attack. 2 wolves, moving at incredible speed, darted not toward the shooter, Red, but toward Silent. One came from the front, the other from behind, forcing the giant to spin in place, fending off lightning-fast attacks. They didn't try to tear him to pieces. They just tied him up in combat, isolating him from the rest. Another wolf, like a shadow, slid toward Lame, forcing him to retreat a few steps and focus all his attention on himself. The leader hissed with rage, holding his knife in front of him, but the beast was too fast, circling him without giving him a second to breathe. The leader and another wolf moved toward Red. Seeing the 2 gray deaths rushing toward him, Red completely lost his head. He fired again, missing once more, and, throwing away his useless weapon, turned to run. He didn't look where he was going. His eyes were filled with pure animal terror. He took only 3 steps and crashed into the thick root of an old fir tree which he hadn't noticed in his panic. There was a dull thud and a muffled cry. Redhead collapsed to the ground, hitting his head painfully. The gun flew out of his hand. He tried to get up, but at that moment, a shadow loomed over him. The leader of the pack was standing right above him. He didn't growl. He just stared at the man, lying on the ground with his eyes, yellow as old amber. Saliva dripped slowly from his mouth, dripping onto the face of the gangster, who was mad with fear. The redhead froze, afraid to even breathe. He could feel the animal's hot breath and see every one of its fangs. He was completely at the mercy of the predator. At that moment, the first large, heavy raindrops fell from the sky. The storm had begun. The lame man saw that his gang had been defeated. The silent man desperately fought off 2 wolves, but it was only a matter of time. The red-haired man was immobilized and completely demoralized, and he himself was being pushed to the edge of the ravine by a fast and intelligent predator. The plan had failed. The forest, which he considered his hunting ground, showed him who was the real master here. The wind picked up, whipping wet branches across his face. Rain poured down in sheets, instantly soaking his clothes to the skin. Lightning struck somewhere very close, and almost immediately there was a deafening clap of thunder. In the flash of lightning, the lame one saw the wolf's eyes opposite him for a second. There was no malice in them. There was a cold sentence. He realized that the old man standing by the pine tree was not just a random witness. He was part of this forest, its protector. And they were a plague that the forest had decided to get rid of. And now this process of purification was in full swing. The redhead under the wolf whimpered quietly like a beaten puppy. The silent one let out a furious roar when he was painfully bitten on the leg. Lame took another step back, and his heels slipped off the wet rock at the very edge of the precipice. He waved his arms desperately, trying to keep his balance. The ground crumbled beneath his feet, taking with it his last chance of salvation. For a brief moment, his gaze met Petrovich's calm stare. There was no malice or sympathy in the old man's eyes, only silent observation. It was as if the forest itself was looking at him, delivering its final verdict. The lame man understood. This was the end. His calculating mind, his cruelty, his experience, all of it was nothing in the face of true wild nature. The wolf that had been closing in on him stopped, simply watching. It didn't even need to attack. The man had trapped himself. A gust of wind blew with renewed force. The lame man lost his footing. With a desperate cry that was drowned out by the roar of the storm, he fell down into the dark, gaping mouth of Devil's Ravine. And in the clearing, under the pouring rain, remained his 2 accomplices, surrounded by a pack of wolves, and the old hunter, who had become an unwitting witness to forest justice. The redhead, lying on the ground, closed his eyes, waiting for the fatal bite. But the bite did not come. Instead, he heard the wolf above him let out a low, vibrating growl. It was not a threat. It was something else. Something his pathetic gangster mind could not comprehend. The redhead lay huddled on the wet ground, feeling his own body begin to give way. The paralyzing terror was stronger than the pain from the fall. He waited for the tearing pain, the death throes, but it didn't come. Instead, the alpha wolf standing over him simply stared. There was no hatred in its yellow eyes, only cold assessment, like a surgeon before an operation. The beast tilted its head slightly to one side, and a low, vibrating sound came from its mouth, like the rumble of a distant engine. It was not a threatening growl. It was a statement of complete and absolute superiority. Then, with the same unhurried grace with which he had appeared, the leader took a step back. Then another. He wasn't leaving, He was simply making it clear, your life is in my hands, and I decide when to end it. The redhead gasped for air mixed with rain and the smell of wet fur. He realized that he had just been humiliated in a way that even the most hardened criminals in prison had never humiliated him. He had been written off as nothing. At the other end of the clearing, a different drama was unfolding. Molchun, having received a painful bite on his calf, roared with rage and pain. He was a fighter, accustomed to solving problems with brute force. But how do you fight shadows? The wolves did not charge head-on. They circled, making lightning-fast lunges at his legs, forcing him to turn awkwardly and lose his balance on the slippery ground. He swung his huge fists, but they struck only air. He saw Lame disappear into the abyss. He saw Red lying on the ground, defeated by a single glance from the leader. And for the first time, his apathetic but pragmatic brain failed him. The program, consisting of simple commands, take, hit, grab, could not find a solution to this problem. Wolves were unpredictable. They were part of this forest, just like thunderstorms, windbreaks, or swampy marshes. And fighting the forest was pointless. He waved off one of the wolves again and, taking advantage of a moment's respite, glanced at Red. He was lying curled up in a ball, useless. But leaving him here meant signing his death warrant. And in their world, there were certain rules. "Get up!" roared Molchun, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. He took 2 heavy steps toward Red, kicking away a wolf that had approached. The beast deftly dodged him. Molchun grabbed his accomplice by the collar and jerked him to his feet. Red stood swaying, his eyes empty and meaningless. "Run!" Molchun barked again. He practically dragged Red's limp body behind him, away from the ravine, in the direction from which they had come. And then the wolves' tactics changed again. They stopped attacking. Now they just followed them. 2 gray shadows on the right, 2 on the left. The leader followed 10 meters behind, controlling the retreat. They did not allow the bandits to turn off the path, cutting off any attempts to hide in the thicket. They had turned into a convoy. Petrovich, standing under his pine tree, watched this outcome with bated breath. He did not see wild animals, but intelligent guardians expelling evil from their territory. It was not murder. It was expulsion. He saw the limping Molchun, leaning on Rigi as if on a crutch, hobbling through the wall of rain. He saw the shadows of wolves following them relentlessly. The bandits' path turned into hell. Every step through the soggy clay sent pain through Molchun's bitten leg. Rigi muttered something incoherently, stumbling over every root. The wolves did not approach, but their silent presence weighed on their nerves more than an open attack. They drove them through the windbreak, across streams that had turned into raging torrents. They drove them to the very edge of the old forest, to the line where the pine forest gave way to scrub and a country road came into view. There the pack stopped. As if on command, all 5 wolves froze at the edge of their territory. Silent, unable to believe his luck, he turned around. The leader stood in the rain, water dripping from his gray fur. He looked at the 2 people without expression. His mission was accomplished. Molchun, without saying a word, hoisted Rigi onto his shoulder and, limping and looking back, trudged toward the road where they had abandoned the Dasha owner's car. The gray figures turned and, as silently as they had appeared, disappeared into the forest. Silence reigned once more in the clearing near Devil's Ravine, broken only by the fading rain. Petrovich slowly emerged from his hiding place. The adrenaline receded, leaving behind a hollow emptiness and trembling knees. He was alone. He approached the spot where Rigi had been lying and saw a pistol lying in the mud. Careful not to leave any traces, he picked it up with the tip of his knife and wrapped it in his handkerchief. It was evidence. Then his gaze fell on the edge of the ravine, where the lame man had disappeared. The old man's heart skipped a beat. He was a gamekeeper, not an executioner. He slowly and carefully approached the edge. The wet ground and rocks were unstable. He lay down on his stomach and looked down. The slopes of the ravine were lost in the thick gloom. It was at least 15 meters deep. Below, he could see piles of boulders and fallen trees. There was almost no chance of survival after such a fall. Petrovich was about to crawl back when suddenly his ear caught something amid the sound of the wind. At first, he thought he was imagining things. He froze, listening. Then again, a quiet, muffled groan came from below. It was almost inaudible, on the very edge of hearing. But it was there. The lame man was alive, wounded, crippled, but alive. And he was there, at the bottom of the ravine, alone with the forest that had just sentenced him to death. Petrovich's breath caught in his throat. It was one thing to witness forest justice, but quite another to leave a man to die, knowing he was still breathing. Petrovich was faced with a choice that was heavier than any rock in the clearing. To leave him there would mean allowing the forest to complete its judgment. It would have been fair. This man, the lame one, had deprived him of his peace, threatened his life. He was a predator whom nature itself had punished. But the quiet moan that came from below was not the roar of a beast. It was the moan of a human being, and Petrovich, who had lived his entire life in the forest, knew the difference. He could track down and hunt down a beast, but he never left a wounded man to die. Not even one like this. It was his own law, carved into his soul by years spent alone with nature, which, for all its cruelty, knew no malice. He slowly got to his feet. The decision was made. It brought him no joy, only a heavy burden. He would not save a bandit. He would try to save a human being. What to do with him afterwards would be decided by other people and other laws. He quickly looked around. There was no direct descent. But the left slope of the ravine was not completely sheer. Crooked birch trees grew there, clinging to the rocks with their roots, and ledges were visible. It was a dangerous, almost insane path for a 68-year-old man. But it was the only way. He took off his old canvas backpack and checked its contents. A water flask, some leftover bread, a coil of strong rope, and a first aid kit. The standard kit of a gamekeeper, which had saved his life more than once. He slung the backpack back onto his back, tightening the straps. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the damp, ozone-rich air, and began his descent. Every step was a risk. Wet rocks slid under the soles of his boots. He clung to thin tree trunks that bent but held. His fingers, accustomed to an axe and a knife, dug into the cracks in the rock. He moved slowly, methodically, checking each foothold before putting his weight on it. He didn't think about the killer waiting for him below. He thought only about the next step, the next ledge, the next breath. The forest that had just been his ally had now become an obstacle that had to be overcome. The descent took almost half an hour, which seemed like an eternity. When his feet finally touched the solid ground at the bottom of the ravine, he was breathing heavily, and his whole body was shaking from the strain. It was damp and gloomy here. A dim light filtered through the torn clouds above. He found the lame man immediately. He was lying at the foot of the cliff on a pile of sharp rocks. His body was bent unnaturally. Petrovich approached him. The leader was conscious. His cold gray eyes looked at the old man with a wild mixture of hatred, pain, and fear. Now he was a hunted animal, His left leg was twisted at an impossible angle, and a piece of bone protruded from his torn trouser leg. His right arm lay limply beside him, apparently broken as well. "Water?" croaked the lame man. His lips cracked from the effort. Petrovich silently took off his backpack, took out a flask, and carefully lifted the bandit's head, allowing him to take a few sips. The lame drank greedily, choking. When the flask was empty, he leaned back, breathing heavily. "Why? Did you come down?" he managed to say. "You're still alive," Petrovich replied curtly, taking out a first aid kit. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew what to do for broken bones and bleeding. He cut the trouser leg on the wounded leg with a knife. The sight was gruesome. It was an open fracture. He had to stop the bleeding and immobilize the limb somehow to prevent shock. "Hang in there," he said and set to work. The lame man clenched his teeth, his body arched. But he didn't make a sound. Only a hoarse breath escaped his lips. Petrovich worked silently and intently. He washed the wound with the remaining water and applied a tight bandage using his handkerchief and bandages. Then he found 2 sturdy, straight sticks and, using twine, made a makeshift splint. It was rough work, but it could save the lame man's life. When he had finished with the leg, he examined the arm in the same way. It was a closed fracture. He immobilized it by tying it to the body with a piece of his own shirt. All this time, the lame man watched him, and the hatred in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by confusion and bewilderment. He, a cruel and calculating predator, accustomed to taking everything by force, could not understand the motives of this old man. When first aid had been administered, Petrovich sat down on a rock nearby. He was exhausted, dead tired. The storm had passed, and evening twilight was falling on the forest. The silence was broken only by the rustling of drops falling from the leaves, the heavy breathing of the wounded man. You won't get me out of here," said the lame man. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. His voice was no longer authoritative, but broken. "I know," Petrovich replied simply. He looked up at the steep, wet walls of the ravine. The way down was a one-way road. Even for him alone, the climb back up now in the twilight was almost impossible. And with a wounded man in his arms, it was completely unrealistic. They were both trapped, victim and executioner, savior and saved. 2 men at the bottom of a stone bag, cut off from the rest of the world. "Will they come back for me?" asked the lame man hopefully, referring to his accomplices. Petrovich shook his head. "The wolves chased them all the way to the road. They won't come here. They're scared to death." Despair was written all over the lame man's face. He was alone. Well, not alone. He was here with this strange old man, who had first been his prey and was now his only chance. But that chance seemed illusory. Night was falling on the forest, and with night would come the cold. For a wounded man without fire or shelter, the cold could be worse than any wolf. The silence at the bottom of the ravine grew thick and cold. Twilight quickly gave way to impenetrable darkness, barely broken by the dim light filtering through the sky. Petrovich stood up. He couldn't just sit there. The cold, dampness, and shock could kill the lame man faster than gangrene. He needed fire. He needed some kind of shelter for the night. He began to methodically search the bottom of the ravine. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the forest, could make out the silhouettes of fallen trees and piles of rocks. He moved slowly but confidently, his experience as a gamekeeper telling him where to look. Under an overhanging rock ledge, where the ground was relatively dry, he found what he needed, a small niche sheltered from the wind and the last drops of rain. Nearby lay a pile of old, half-rotten logs. Petrovich returned to the lame man. "We need to move you. Can you help a little?" Lame shook his head, his face contorted by a new wave of pain. Petrovich realized he would have to act alone. It seemed an impossible task. The stocky, heavy man was an impossible burden for a frail old man. But Petrovich wasn't thinking about weight. He was thinking about leverage. He slipped his arms under the gangster's back, braced his feet against the rocks, and straining every muscle, groaned as he lifted his torso. Then, step by step, dragging him along, he pulled him toward the shelter. Every meter was torture. For both of them. Petrovich was gasping for breath, and the lame one was groaning through clenched teeth. When they finally reached the niche, the old man collapsed beside him, trying to catch his breath. For several minutes, they just lay there in the darkness, listening to the beating of their own hearts. Then Petrovich forced himself to get up again. Fire. Fire was now the deciding factor. He gathered dry branches, found a piece of birch bark, and took his everlasting tinder and flint from his pocket. His hands were shaking with fatigue, but his movements were measured and precise. He struck a spark, then another. The dry moss he always carried with him began to smolder. He carefully fanned the flame, adding thin twigs. After a few minutes, the small, timid flame turned into a steady fire that dispelled the darkness and gave off precious warmth. The lame man stared at the fire, the dancing flames reflected in his eyes. He was silent. His brain, accustomed to a world of violence and betrayal, desperately tried to process what was happening. This old man, he should have killed him, or left him here to die. Instead, he had climbed down into the ravine, helped him, dragged him to shelter, and built a fire. Why? What was in it for him? The question spun silently in his head, and he couldn't find an answer. Meanwhile, Petrovich took the remains of bread and a flask of water from his backpack. He handed half of the bread to the lame man. The latter looked at the piece, then at the old man. "Eat," said Petrovich. "You'll need your strength." The lame man slowly took the bread with his good hand and began to chew. They ate in silence, staring into the fire. Two men from completely different worlds, trapped at the bottom of a ravine, became companions in misfortune. Their hostility disappeared, dissolving in the cold night and their shared despair. All that remained was a simple, primitive task: to survive. "You're a former gamekeeper, aren't you?" asked the lame man hoarsely, breaking the silence. Petrovich nodded. "I can tell," continued the bandit. "You know everything. Every branch." He paused. "And I grew up in the city, in basements. There's a forest there, too. Only the laws are different. It's you or them." Petrovich said nothing. He stared into the fire, and it seemed to him that he could see his whole life in it. There he was, young, walking this path for the first time. There was his wife, laughing as she gathered berries. There he was, finding that very same wolf cub in the trap. And now today, the chase, the fear, and the strange, quiet triumph when the forest came to his defense. "Why didn't the wolves touch you?" asked the lame man again. This question tormented him more than anything else. There was something wrong with it, something that violated all the laws of nature as he understood them. Petrovich shifted his gaze to the wounded wolf. "A debt is a debt," he said quietly. "I saved his life when he was a cub. He got caught in a trap, and the forest, it remembers everything, both good and evil." The lame man shuddered at these words. Everything fell into place. It wasn't mysticism. It wasn't a miracle. It was simply the law of cause and effect. a law that had been distorted beyond recognition in his world of basements and prison cells. There, kindness was weakness, and gratitude was a bargaining chip. But here, in the forest, everything was real. He looked at the old man again, at his wrinkled, weather-beaten face, at his calm eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt not fear, not hatred, but something like respect. This old man was dangerous, not with a knife or a gun, but with his connection to this place, his inner strength that could not be broken or bought. The night dragged on endlessly. They kept the fire going, taking turns falling into a restless sleep. Petrovich knew that in the morning they would have to make a decision. Sitting here and waiting for help was pointless. No one would look for them in this ravine. So they had to get out, alone, so that he could bring help later. Leaving the lame one here, alone and wounded, was a huge risk. But there was no other way out. When the first gray rays of dawn touched the treetops, Petrovich made his decision. He left the lame almost all the remaining water and the last piece of bread. "I'll climb up," he said. "I'll go to the village for help. It will take time. I may not be back until evening if all goes well." The lame man looked at him. There was no trace of the former hostility in his gaze. You'll come back?" he asked, his voice filled with undisguised, childlike hope. "I said I'd bring help. That means I will," Petrovich replied firmly. He checked his equipment, put out the fire so as not to attract unnecessary attention, and approached the place where the slope was gentlest. He turned around. "If you hear wolves, don't be afraid. They won't hurt you. You're under my protection now." With these words, he began the ascent. It was even more difficult than the descent. His muscles ached, his hands were rubbed raw, but he stubbornly, inch by inch, climbed upward toward the saving light. At the bottom of the ravine lay the wounded bandit, whose life now depended entirely on the word given by the old hunter. And for the first time in his life, Viktor Belov, nicknamed Lame, prayed. He did not pray to a god he did not believe in, but that this stubborn old man would survive and keep his promise. What do you think was the hardest thing for Petrovich? Deciding to help his enemy or physically getting out of the ravine to call for help?